the Honorable Marigold Harding, Chair of the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts Board of Management, Miss Dorrit Campbell, Interim Principal, Miss Kerry-Ann Henry, Vice Principal of Administration and Resource Development, Dr. Roger Williams, Acting Vice Principal of Academic Affairs, Dr. Amina Blackwood Meeks, College Orator, Professor Rosalia Hamilton, CEO of Lascaux Chin Foundation and this evening's keynote speaker, deans, directors, faculty, staff, students, and all other members of the college community, good evening and welcome to the 13th Gender and Development Lecture. Presenting another Gender and Development Lecture at the college is something that demonstrates our commitment to gender justice for all. The pioneering efforts of Caribbean feminists like Lucille Mathering Mayer, Barbara Bailey, Eudine Barito, and Rhoda Reddock, just to name a few, have set the foundation for us to engage in continuous gender discourse. The theme of tonight's lecture, a gendered perspective of the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable SMEs in Jamaica, represents an opportunity to examine and interrogate small and medium-sized enterprises in Jamaica. Caribbean feminist and pro-feminist scholars have provided theoretical frameworks and arguments to advance the understanding of gender in the Caribbean. Yet, situating gender as a part of entry in most discussions remains a difficult phenomenon given its existing categories of demarcations stemming from its patriarchal history. We are constantly reminded of the founding and prevailing dichotomous fallacies of boy versus girl, blue versus pink, rational versus emotional in our everyday lives. Yet, resolutions for these gendered attributes and divide have advertently or inadvertently disdained, disregarded, and untheorized gender as a construct. These changing gendered attributes are evident in Jamaica, and this can be seen in the changing roles of men and women, not only in the family, but in SMEs. An analysis using a gendered perspective of the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable SMEs in Jamaica is influenced by various concepts, theories, and ontologies. It is important in deepening our understanding of the nexus of SMEs, gender ideologies, and the gender system. Gender-responsive analysis remains fragile in the wider economic field because of the lack of understanding of what gender really is. Business arenas are influenced and determined by patriarchal ideologies, which, in most instances, support men as managers and directors. Division of business resources and the implementation of policies are driven by patriarchal interests, both internal and external. However, statistics show that many SMEs are female-owned and operated. Looking at SMEs during the COVID-19 pandemic is therefore important, and merging a gender-inclusive lens within this is crucial. This is particularly critical during the pandemic so that a robust analysis can be given to support vulnerable SMEs. What contradictions are involved when we examine vulnerable SMEs and entrepreneurs through a gendered lens? What messages are faintly conveyed about gender as a critical concept? When we scrutinize men and women and the role they play in management, business, and the financial sphere, what lessons, practical tools, and best practices can be offered within a gendered framework? Tonight's lecture, a gendered perspective of the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable SMEs in Jamaica, positions us very well to start the discussion in an area in gender that is often overlooked. With these opening remarks, I invite Ms. Dorrit Campbell, Interim Principal, to bring greetings on behalf of the college. Thank you.
The Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts is pleased to bring you the 13th Gender and Development Lecture, specifically coordinated through the School of Arts Management and Humanities. This year's lecture is delivered at a time when the college observes its 45th year as a group of 6 schools located at 1 Arthur Wint Drive, and when Jamaica observes its 60th year of independence. Therefore, the lecture forms part of the college's annual Founders Week celebrations and also takes into consideration Jamaica's progress in building awareness of gender equity and gender mainstreaming in the social, economic, political, and cultural fabric of the country. The Edna Manley College has been one of the front runners in advocacy for gender justice. In August 2009, the college introduced its first formal gender course, Gender in Society, Issues and Theoretical Considerations, and it has since followed with several other initiatives to continue its advocacy for gender equity and mainstreaming in the life and work of the college. In 2010, the college hosted the inaugural Women's Day to highlight the work of women in arts and culture in Jamaica and the region. The forum served to create a rude awakening to high levels of gender disparities in Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean region, even as it challenged us to becoming stronger advocates for gender justice. The college continues to demonstrate its commitment to mainstreaming gender in its policies and curriculum. This progress was recognized by the Bureau of Women's Affairs and UN Women, who awarded the college the Gender Focal Point stamp for mainstreaming gender and for active involvement in the Gender Ambassadors Program, otherwise known as GAP. GAP incorporates a variety of pivotal points that are school-related initiatives to address gender-based violence and gender discrimination. It is also significant to note that this year's lecture takes place against the background of a global health crisis which has severely impacted small, medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. We too join with the entire world in understanding the many implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. The SME sector is regarded as the most innovative system in any economy, especially middle and low-income economies such as those in the Caribbean. This sector is one of the main catalysts of economic growth. Its significance lies in its potential for job creation and supply of goods and services to a large share of the population. Data from the World Bank Enterprise Surveys suggests that SMEs comprise as much as 99.5% of all businesses in the region, 60% of the employed population, and 25% of GDP. These small businesses were severely impacted by the pandemic. Some could not deliver adequately on their goods and services. Others had to scale down their businesses, while others were pushed beyond their survival thresholds and were forced to close their doors, leaving several workers jobless. Truth be told, even some of the very large organizations had their resilience sorely tested by the pandemic, and some are still struggling to stay afloat. With that struggle comes the tough decision to reduce the size of the workforce, resulting in significant job losses for both men and women, but even more so for women. The theme then for this year's lecture is a timely reminder of our social and economic realities. It helps us to understand and appreciate from a gendered perspective how COVID-19 has impacted vulnerable SMEs in Jamaica. And who best to provide this perspective than the Chief Executive Officer of the Lasco Chin Foundation, Professor Rosalie Hamilton, who has tremendous experience in SMEs and who's also very passionate about gender justice. We're very pleased to have her delivering this year's lecture, and we look forward to her expert and engaging handling of the topic. I'd also like to thank Dr. Keynote Sr., Dean of the School of Arts, Management and Humanities. He's also chair of the Gender and Development Lecture Committee, and himself a gender specialist, for leading the charge in building our awareness of gender issues. Thanks to all the members of faculty and students who have ensured that all the logistics are lined up for this lecture. And thank you all for participating. God bless you all.
A blessed good evening to everyone. I'd like to add my own bit of welcome to you on this very special occasion, this 13th Gender Lecture during this momentous time for the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts, our 45th anniversary in the year of the Diamond Jubilee of our Jamaica land we love. And what an honor, an absolute joy and pleasure that Professor Rosalia Hamilton agreed to deliver the lecture on this occasion. I think that she is uniquely placed to help us understand the special conditions of SMEs and why they should have extraordinary considerations during times of crisis, such as the one from which we are emerging, which we have come to call the COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Hamilton has been able to very deftly combine her theoretical understanding of entrepreneurship and development with its practical application, and her scholarship has been demonstrated at the University of Technology, where she gained the professorship in the Scotiabank Chair in Entrepreneurship and Development. Her contributions to national development are recorded in her consultancy with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, and the fact that she also served as advisor to the Prime Minister of Jamaica during the period 2006 to 2007. Professor Hamilton's legacy can be seen in many projects. One of them is her establishment of the MSME Alliance, a network of business organizations which she also ran for 10 years. Of course, we know that she also established the Institute of Law and Economics. Currently, she serves as the CEO of the Lasco Chin Foundation. I ask you to welcome Professor Hamilton and tune your ears to the lecture she's about to deliver.
Dr. Keynote, Senior, Chair of the Gender and Development Lecture and Dean of the School of Arts, Management and Humanities. The Honorable Marigold Hardin, Chair of Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts Board of Management. Ms. Dorrit Campbell, Interim Principal. Ms. Carrie-Ann Henry, Vice Principal of Administration and Resource Management. Dr. Roger Williams, Acting Vice Principal of Academic Affairs. Dr. Amina Blackwood-Meets, College Orator. Mrs. Claudia Woon Chin, Registrar. Ms. Kai Wigan, President of the Students' Council, deans, faculty, staff, students, all members of the college family, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. And I'm here to speak to you about a gendered perspective on the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable entrepreneurs in Jamaica. You know, this indeed is a heavy topic. I want to start by saying a gendered perspective matters, especially now in response to the COVID pandemic. And I want to start with an explanation of the concept, and the concept that I'm working with here, this idea of a gendered perspective. What exactly is that? I see it as a view of the socially constructed roles, behaviors, and experiences of men, women, boys, girls, and gender diverse people. These gender roles are dominantly constructed by religion. And we should note that these perspectives are shaped by the inherent biases in existing data sets and the available gender data. And so we have a sense of these gender roles and how they're playing out in COVID. We're relying on the existing data, and sex disaggregated data is typically used to do gender analysis, and sometimes it's not available. And certainly the category of gender diverse people is not readily available, and so there are limited perspectives we can glean from that category. Nonetheless, I'll go with what I have, and when you look at the literature, we're seeing some roles that we know very well. And I want to refer to the Women's Health Survey that was done in 2016 that points to the fact that about 77.4% of the women who were interviewed for this survey agreed with the statement that it is natural, God-given, God intended that a man should be the head of his family. And another 70% agree that a woman's main role is to take care of the home. And you have similar kinds of perspectives. A wife should obey her husband, even if she disagrees with him. And so these perspectives dominate our conceptions of our role as men and women. And boys are being socialized to be men who protect and provide for their family. So I'm going to come back to these roles. Other roles, for example, the violence between husband and wife is a private matter. You can see that most of the persons in the survey held those views. And so these roles exist, and we're going to see how they're playing out in the COVID pandemic. In the case of the LGBT community, there's a diverse set of gender identities, and gender and sexuality are both separate as well as interlinked. It's fairly complex, nonetheless, there is a set of gender identities that one has to wade through to really get a true perspective on that community. The core themes that I want to present and start this presentation with is the idea that COVID-19 has exacerbated the pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities that exist in our society. And these include gender and business-related inequalities and vulnerabilities. And so the impact on women, men, and the LGBT community have been unequal and different. So throughout my presentation, these themes will be repeated. Now, when we look at global and regional studies, and we look at even newspaper reports about what's happening, we're already seeing some, and we can discern some gender differences. Looking at the data that tracks men's responses and impacts, we see that men are more likely to die from COVID. Generally, there's a higher rate of COVID infection and death that it's evident there. In fact, the data suggests that women there are more cases. And if you look at the Jamaican data, for example, more women are infected, but more men die. And the numbers is not significantly different, but nonetheless, we're seeing this across the world. And there's a loss, of course, of male income, and in many households, the higher income is the man's income. In some households, of course, that's changing as women increasingly are able to earn more. But certainly when you look at wage data, you see that men still bring home the larger share of income. And so when they die, of course, their capacity to protect and support their families is, of course, shattered. And this again feeds into the idea that men are the providers, and so when they're the providers for families, and if they're dying more in COVID, we see some impacts there. Women, on the other hand, have lost out in terms of jobs and income and safety. And so what we're seeing is that the quality of life of women have worsened during the pandemic. There are more domestic violence. In fact, there's a lot of discussions about the hidden pandemic, the shadow pandemic, and that too feeds into the norms of violence between a man and a woman as a private matter. So a lot of this violence is taking place in the homes, and they're not reported. We have evidence that women are eating less and eating less healthy. Again, women's role to take care of the home and to take care of the children means that women are putting the well-being of the family in front of their own. And the data is picking that up. And generally, there's been a lot more stress and worry on the part of women. And when we look at the data on LGBT people, we see that mental health seems to be a big deal. There's been studies that suggest that the mental health has been negatively impacted, both more widely and more severely among LGBT people relative to their non-LGBT peers. And there's a Caribbean study that was done, and it provided some data on the extent of this. We saw in that particular study, it was done in 2020, and we saw that 43% of those surveys were positive for depression, and another 45 that were screening positive for anxiety. So we're not seeing, I haven't seen any relative data compared to other groups in the society, but we do have a sense that that issue of mental health is playing out. And there was a newspaper report that pointed to a sharp increase in homelessness. And again, very different impacts, and these are some of the findings that we're seeing. Now, we can look at all of these impacts through the lens of a couple of things. The disparities we're seeing, the outcomes we're seeing are linked to things like economic opportunity. And if we look at, for example, in the case of women, women have performed 3 times more unpaid care and domestic work during the COVID pandemic relative to men. And again, feeding into the idea that women's main role is to take care of the home. And so a lot of that is taking place. It's worsened by the fact that, you know, kids were at home, women had to be caregivers, teachers, lovers, everything. And it has created stress for women, and the data is picking this up. Caribbean women are typically concentrated in tourism-related services and the sales sector. And so these sectors have been exposed to economic shocks. And so we see the impact there. Men's employment have been more diversified. And so those are some of the outcomes that we're seeing. The worsening gender inequality is evident in the labor market, and especially with the business ownership, and we're seeing some gender issues there. And with respect to resilience, in terms of financial resilience, we're also seeing female-headed households having difficulties there. And when you look at some of the global data, women make up 70% of the healthcare workers, and they have seen the impact of that with respect to, for example, PPEs that didn't fit women's bodies, and other kinds of impacts that speak to where women are placed and situated during this pandemic. Another area that we can group a lot of these disparities and outcomes are linked to the endowments and the social status of individuals. So for example, if you're wealthy and well-placed in the society and you have access to good quality health care, then you're among the first who got your vaccines, and you have your doctors on speed dial, and you're able to navigate and do fairly well. We have, of course, what I call an apartheid system of education. A lot of people are using that term now. If you go to good schools, you've been doing well, and certainly during the pandemic, the equipment and so on and support was there for you. And if you're not going to those traditionally well-placed and positioned schools, then the impact has been devastating. And we're seeing learning gaps, etc. I'm going to say a little more about the education impact. And of course, if there are learning losses that are taking place, there are many homes in which there's a preference to educate kids relative to boys. We can see how that can be exacerbated during this period. The school dropout rates, there are gender differences we pick up there. And so again, areas where we'll see gender differences. But again, if you look at things like infrastructure, housing, and so on, the capacity to social distance has been truly challenging for certain groups that didn't have space in their homes to social distance, especially when people have had the COVID, and that's really when you need to create that distance. Access to power makes a difference because, of course, that's access to resources. The other broad area is this broad area called agency, and the extent to which people have a voice and have the power to make decisions. And so if males dominate their homes, and for example, the man in the home says, well, I'm not no vaccine, then of course, that whole household is now vulnerable. Feeding again into this idea that men are natural heads of families. And when you see that, you see differential types of impacts. Women have been generally underrepresented in the field of leadership in the healthcare sector, and so the capacity to make gender-based decisions that could help women or men, depending on the impacts, could have challenges there as well. And the LGBT community, we did talk about the fact that there have been impacts, and includes health discrimination with respect to accessing healthcare. So when we look generally, that's kind of what we're seeing in terms of impacts. I want to drill down now to impacts on the business. And when we look at evidence from developing countries, we're seeing that the pandemic on business have been severe and widespread. And it's been really very negative with respect to sales, and we picked this up throughout the data. The decline in sales have been severe. With respect to micro and small firms, and these are the most vulnerable set of firms in the business landscape, they're more likely to find that they have to lay off workers, and while almost 50% of firms in developing countries report greater use of technology and ability to adapt to a new environment for doing business, the data suggests that these micro and small firms were less able to adapt to the digital solutions as a coping mechanism that could enable them to survive and thrive. When we look at Caribbean business data, there's an IDB study that was done last year, and that pointed to 90% of the firms in the Caribbean reporting the impact on COVID as negative. In the case of Jamaica, it was 95% of these firms. And again, we're seeing the most prevalent effects as lowering sales, lower capacity utilization, reduction in labor, people are cutting back and so on in order to cope. When we look at data with respect to women-owned and led businesses, there's an even greater negative impact. And what we see in data that we're able to look at, you're seeing, for example, the reduction in sales at the level of 93%. And when you see the comparative data with respect to men, then the data, of course, is less. Now, we look at other impacts across the Caribbean. One of the things that we saw is that these women-owned and led firms were about 1.4 times more likely to close. So either close temporarily or permanently. And that's a real challenge now in this COVID environment, because some businesses just will not open. And we hope, and I think in the absence of the kinds of key interventions that are necessary, we hope it won't be disproportionately those of women who are unable to open. With respect to the challenges, I think the data also picks up the idea that there are greater challenges faced by women-owned and led firms because of the challenges with childcare. And the data suggests that, of course, the burdens that women carry with respect to the child caring responsibility and just general care for people in the home. Now, to come to my focus on the most vulnerable entrepreneurs, they've fared worse during this pandemic. And they're typically, we're talking about street vendors, small business, micro businesses, craft traders, taxi drivers and so on. Many of them living in crime-prone communities. And so the COVID pandemic has exacerbated the pre-existing vulnerabilities and realities of these small businesses, and it has made it essentially worse. Now, I wanted to share this graph because it's a very telling graph that captures the context of these entrepreneurs prior to COVID. If you look at the pre-COVID context, and many of them, as I said, live in crime-prone communities, we have, for a long time in Jamaica, an epidemic crime rate. When we talk about epidemic crime rate, we're talking about, according to the UN, homicide rate of 10 per 100,000 citizens or above. Now, this data is instructive because if we were to look at the population rate and calculate the per 100,000 citizens rate back in the 70s, we see that it was about in 1974 that we were at a homicide rate of 10 per 100,000. Back in 1994. And that's about 200 persons. Now, when we look at the time since then, what we've seen is about 17 years of murders above 1,000 persons annually. And we see that in 2017 was the third highest homicide rate in the history of tracking the data from our independence. And now is a good time, actually, to reflect on this data because we're talking about 60 years of independence. And for these 60 years, we can look at this trend of homicide. And so in 2017, we had this third highest ever. And in 2019, we saw that it went down a bit. But in 2020, the rates went down globally across the world, but we turned out to be the highest homicide rate in the region. That's very, very significant. And so it's clear that the crime rate, murders in particular, homicides in particular, didn't ease up, and certainly not easing up at the level that's required for us to be a quote-unquote normal society. And we know that the main perpetrators as well as victims of violent crime are young men, aged 16 and 24. And so I thought I'd share the headlines in the Gleaner of January 18, 2018, to put in perspective the data that took place in that year, 2017, third highest in our history. What was happening there? The headline says, young and dangerous, teenage gangsters driving up the crime rate. And when you look at the data, 81% of teenagers killed, 78 teenagers arrested for shooting, 148 arrested for illegal possession of firearms. And it included 9 girls, ages 14. There were 2 15-year-olds. 63 were arrested for robbery and aggravation. 58 teenagers arrested and charged with murder, including a 14-year-old boy. And a 15-year-old boy was arrested for raping a woman at gunpoint. All of this in 2017. So we have an epidemic crime problem, and I see this as a consequence of underlying poverty and associated problems that we can treat as, refer to them as kind of absence of key assets, assets that we need to survive and to live in dignity in a modern world. And that includes access to relevant institutional support, infrastructure and housing. I mean, we've been seeing recently on the television, and it's been on social media, the almost inhumane living conditions of some of our people. We talked about health and well-being and access to good health care, and even access to power, because people understand that if you have access to power, then you can have access to resources. But at the center of these absence of key assets required for us to grow and to develop as a nation is the lack of adequate education. And so I'm going to spend a little time on this education crisis that we have in Jamaica. The problem starts with inadequate early education, childhood education. And the reform of education report that was done, chaired by Orlando Patterson, that report has a whole chapter devoted to early childhood education. There's a lot of issues there. By the time you get to primary school, the data is suggesting that 30% of the kids in primary school cannot read. 50% cannot write. 57% could not identify information in a simple sentence. The secondary school enrollment rates have been problematic, and you're seeing that the further you get into the secondary school years, the less kids are turning up, especially the boys. And so by the time you get to CSEC exams, and we have some data from 2019 that's in the report, you have 55% of the students as females sitting the exams and 44 males. And of that 32,617 students that sat the exam in 2019, 42.5% passed at the minimal level, five or more CSEC subjects, with English or maths. Most of them females, 47%, 34% males. But only 28% passed more than 5 subjects with English and maths. This is the gold standard we're setting for our kids. And only 28% are passing, and 31% of those are female, and 23% males. I think that data suggests really troubling situation in our secondary schools. And of course, another shocker is that 70% of the 8-year-olds in 2018 were leaving school without a certificate. Now, all of this is carried on into tertiary level education, where we're seeing 69% of females enroll in tertiary education and only 31% male students. We have a crisis, and the learning gap is going to get bigger, where there's a lot of talk about this learning gap. In fact, the minister just told us, I think over this weekend, that 80,000 students are missing with the resumption of face-to-face. It's a lot of students. And we're seeing the learning gap pre-COVID. 90% females, 76% males have mastery of grade 4 literacy tests in 2018. And with respect to numeracy tests, it's 73 females and 59 male students have mastery. So we have a problem. And the report asked the question and answered it, is this gender problem getting worse? And the data suggests so. We see it at not only maths and literacy and so on, but science, language, arts, social studies, all of them suggest that the large percentages, over 50% of our males are failing. It's room for concern. And so I want to talk a little about the work of the Lascautin Foundation in terms of how we've responded to this challenge. We have a socioeconomic sustainable intervention, what we call a SSI, Entrepreneurship Support Program. And what we do is to target these vulnerable entrepreneurs. So I wanted to share some of the data that we have with respect to what's happening to these entrepreneurs, given the context that they live in and how they've fared during the pandemic. Our long-term objective is to assist these vulnerable groups, especially the at-risk youths, to succeed in their entrepreneurial endeavors. And we try to promote entrepreneurship, ensure that there's a high survival rate, and that they can increase sales and increase asset values over time. And we do this in an extended program that has a two-phase kind of interventions. We also want to make sure that they are staying out of the justice system, the criminal justice system, and not part of the crime problem that we see. So we have a two-phase intervention. The first phase is a kind of 6 months to 1 year where we monitor closely and earn as you learn intervention. And we work with different tracks in our training and our intervention. We have a track 1 that is focused on young people starting up, the youth starting up, the youths that are connected to shops, because we see that young people working with their parents or family members in established businesses, physical businesses, shops, also fare better than those who don't have that kind of support. We also work with shop owners and corner shops and so on, and also youths that are not in retail, wholesale, and although we focus there because it's a way to easily enable them to earn as they learn. We also have a phase 2 where there's a developmental assistance that is a longer-term intervention, because we feel that we have to provide more support for the most vulnerable, because we know that the externalities that they face living in vulnerable communities makes it very difficult. So I'll quickly take you through some of the data that we've been able to discern from the work we're doing. And this is non-random sample data, so I'm not going to generalize for all vulnerable entrepreneurs. I'm talking about the particular group that we're working with. And we are working with these entrepreneurs in collaboration with a number of partners. And this particular data set is entrepreneurs that we work with in collaboration with the Jamaica Social Investment Fund, JSIF. The group that we were targeting with respect to this analysis, 75% of them are females. And it was not an intervention that sought women and tried to bring women in. It was literally trying to find the most vulnerable businesses, those who had established businesses. That was the kind of focus. And we found this group in 12 vulnerable communities in St. Anne, St. Catherine, Kingston, and St. Andrew. And just a quick profile of who they are. 70% of them had little or no education, and that is less than the 5 CSEC subjects. And we can see that most of them really were not able to get that CSEC pass. Only 30% of them were able to benefit from post-secondary education like HEART, NTA. Now, when we looked at that data, 73% of the females had little or no education, while 50% of the males had little or no education. And also with respect to secondary training, you've seen the extent to which the women have less post-secondary training relative to the men. But it is important to note that this is picking up the greater vulnerability to poverty that we see among our female entrepreneurs, because many of them, and especially those with dependents, and I'll say a little about those dependents, are there with very little asset with respect to educational assets and capacity to cope. So we found that 65% of the parents were single parents. 66% of those are female single parents, and all of them, and all of these 66% had very little and no significant education. And that's where we're seeing the problems. It's also problematic when these single parents, female single parents, have many dependents, because the data tells us that's where the vulnerability to poverty, significant poverty, exists. We found that 19% of the single parents had more than 4 dependents, and 66% of them were females. That's really problematic. The work of Herbert Gale and others have pointed to the fact that these single parents, when they have no support, are the mothers and are the female-headed households that generate the most criminality. And so vulnerability to criminality is real. So we want to pay, and we ought to pay attention to these single parents with little support or no support, because they are in trouble, and the data tells us that. When we look at the state of their businesses, we saw that prior to COVID, because we got business people, and they told us, 33% of them told us that their business were either closed, stagnating, or declining. And so, many of them were not doing very well to start. 60% of them felt that they were unlikely to get credit. And we saw that from the data, they gave us more operational challenges, more operating challenges among the males, and a higher tendency for the male firms to decline relative to the females. Now, that's a little different than what we saw in regional studies. But again, this is a particular group of vulnerable entrepreneurs. So we saw that 41% of the males reported that their businesses were closed or stagnated or declined. And similarly, when we asked women about their access to credit, we noticed that most of them felt that they had no expectation of getting credit. And so some of them didn't even try to get credit during this period. And of course, it's a very difficult period, very risky period for credit. Nonetheless, they didn't think they could get it, so they didn't even try. And all of that speaks to the elevated levels of poverty with the households where you're seeing these females who can't get access or won't even try to get access to credit and have dependents. Now, we looked at some data. It's just some of the findings in our data we did in 2020. We looked at the survey. We went in right after. We had some baseline data very early in the year, and then at the end of the year, we went and asked how were they faring. 31% of them told us that they had personal savings, and they had to draw on these personal savings in order to cope. About 77% of them reported being unemployed. That means they were not even in business. And many of them, of course, move from their own business to employment if the employment is available. 78% of them were older women, over 40. And what we're seeing here is a kind of overrepresentation of the female unemployment that we were picking up, because if their business is closed and they're not able to find jobs, then that's significant impact for the kids as well. The main impact on their business, again, we saw male businesses failing, higher levels, and in the case of 2020, we saw about 53% of the businesses that males have are failing versus 36. And overall, we had about nearly half of the pool of persons in the survey saying they're feeling poor and very poor, obviously, with all that was happening. But 82% of them were females. So again, the data suggesting that women and the households and were creating the kinds of impacts that we seem to be picking up throughout the data. Quickly, with respect to 2021, the data pointed to more drawdown on personal savings. So it's getting tougher now by the second year of COVID, 57% of them, and most of them, 75% of them, said they were females, drawing down on savings, more of them going into self-employment. So we saw this massive turn up now. They're restarting the businesses because obviously income is absolutely necessary. So 83% were now reporting that they're in business, and we saw 61% of them over 40, so the older women stepping up to the plate. Now, we saw again the business failure overall, about 48, nearly 50% of them failing, but significantly again, an even higher ratio of male businesses failing. 58% of the male businesses were failing versus 57. Not much difference, but nonetheless, we see this high failure rate among the male firms. And 93% saw the decline in sales. So 2021 was even tougher, and so the data picked this up. More of them felt they were feeling poor and very poor, and again, mostly female, and we saw a little less suggesting that they're now able to be a little more resilient. We did a tracer study, and what we did with the tracer study, we looked at about 6 of the entrepreneurs that we were working with from 2019. 4 females and 2 males. And what we did, we kind of asked them, more probing questions to get a sense of just what was happening. And just to give you a bit of the data that corroborates some of the other findings we had, was that most of them drew down on personal savings. And that's important for the work we do in the Laskatchewan Foundation, because one of the things we do is to encourage savings. And many of them have told us verbally that thank you, because without the savings, it would have been harder to cope. So we also saw most of them were unemployed and the business is not closed down in 2020, but by 2021, more of them restarted the business back in employment, so we saw more resilience taking place. Again, the data, the sales decline and significant vulnerability, both pre-COVID, because we've been tracking them, and what we saw was the worsening of those vulnerabilities by COVID. So overall, from the data, I would say we can draw and we can discern some gender implications. And I would say that the entrepreneurs we've been working with, these vulnerable entrepreneurs, have been adjusting to life and business with COVID. And the evidence suggests that the females may be adjusting a little faster. And we've seen them relying more on their personal savings. We've seen a little more getting into self-employment, starting back up their business from the period 2021. With respect to the negative impacts, however, the caregiving responsibility have been significant, especially during the lockdown. And we saw from the data the vulnerability due to low levels of education and the large number of dependents. The males have also been significantly affected, and we're seeing significant vulnerabilities with respect to relatively more men that are less well educated, and that may in fact even account for the speed of adjustment. But we're seeing that, and we're also seeing, and of course that kind of aligns with some of the national data and the data we saw in the education. And also, relatively more males are closing their business. And we're seeing much more business failure among the men relative to the women. So let me try to wrap up with all of that to talk a little about the strategies. How can we help vulnerable entrepreneurs going forward? What actually can be done? And I want to start by sharing some of the work we're doing in Lasker Chin Foundation. So part of our work is a schooling intervention, a schooling support intervention. And that intervention is not simply providing scholarships for kids. We really think that we have to tackle some of these externalities, the broader environmental factors that impinge a child's capacity to learn. And so we address the nutrition, provide nutritional support to the homes. We provide behavioral and psychosocial support. That's so important, because there have been studies after studies that have pointed to the kind of psychological trauma that our kids are going through from, the abuse in the home, beatings, other kinds of situations. And so when we look at that data, we don't have time to get into that. I can tell you we're seeing extraordinary levels of depression and anxiety and so on among these kids. And so we've provided that support. We provided a lot of educational support, extra lessons, especially during the COVID pandemic. So we did a lot of not just online, we were able to, once we could do face-to-face, we provided that kind of support. We worked with their parents, very important to support the parents during this period, and they were really grateful for the support because their own capacity to help the kids were limited because many of them were stressed. And then we have other kinds of character, gender-based interventions, social interventions to help these youngsters. And of course, we do literacy and numeracy. Again, you saw the data that suggests that these are areas we have to tackle. We also are doing child trafficking intervention, and that's also important because we know that the kids are vulnerable to the abuse and the trafficking that we've seen that have gotten worse during this period. Our entrepreneurship program that I mentioned, we roll out this Learn As You Earn, Earn As You Learn program, and we also do gender-based violence, GBV-type interventions as well. And that was absolutely necessary because we had in some of the training sessions 2-3 women who had to leave the program. Some of them we had to help through the trauma of the abuse. In one case, as I recall, we had to physically go help that young woman get out of the home, a home in which a man was beating her with a plank with a nail in it. That's the kind of abuse that we've experienced. So we've seen that this kind of intervention is absolutely necessary, and so we're trying to add some psychosocial interventions, and we're currently doing that with a USAID-funded project, LPD project, in which now we're providing the kind of social interventions to some of the persons, mainly young men, who have been involved in the criminal justice system. We also have a We Care project. It's women entrepreneurs in the Caribbean, active, resilient, and empowered. That's the acronym for We Care. And it's a project that we're rolling out in Haiti and in Jamaica and in Trinidad and Tobago. And I say we here because I wear another hat as chair of the Caribbean Philanthropic Alliance, and it's in that capacity that this project is being rolled out. But the Lasco Chin Foundation is anchoring the Jamaica leg, and here we are working to provide e-skills, audio, visual, production, e-marketing. And I know for this audience, you'd be pleased to know that we're targeting creatives, and we're doing work with the creative community because we know they too are finding it difficult during this period. And I am of the view that the real solutions out of COVID is creative solutions. And so we have to support and encourage creativity, especially entrepreneurial creativity. We've also provided a number of training sessions, online, face-to-face. We've provided products that the entrepreneurs can resell. We've literally just gave them these products and say, see what you can do, save the funds that you can get as best you can and restock and so on so you can keep going. And of course, the feedback was that what we provided was a lifesaver for many of them and their families. We also provided care packages to the homes and to these entrepreneurs who also have families and need help. And so that's the scale of packages we provided, 230 of these packages valuing over nearly $500,000 and also products of over $240,000. We also took time to recognize mothers who were abused during this period, and so we collaborated with one of our partners, the Joseph and Vera Douglas Family Foundation and E for Life, and we provided care packages to these mothers that have been abused because we felt that certainly on Mother's Day, we should try to remember them. We all did other kinds of interventions. Lockdown and Bill was one of them, and this is an intervention where we provided support, just relevant information that was necessary, where to go if you need help during this COVID crisis. And we were tackling the family violence that we know was real and continues. And we provided discussion, and we used the arts. And this is one of the things that I was really proud of, that we were able to collaborate with Sister Passion in doing this and provide the information in a way that was palatable. So all of this, of course, helped vulnerable entrepreneurs who had to navigate the spaces of business as well as family life during this difficult period. So I want to just share this quote which came out of the research, and I thought it was really an apt research to wrap up this presentation by Ruben Pages. And he said that the COVID-19 has laid bare just how vulnerable people are when they do not have equitable access to opportunities, justice, and healthcare. And that statement speaks volumes because it captures the idea that if you came into COVID with these vulnerabilities and these limitations because of how you're situated in society and the endowments and the resources that you had access to, then clearly you would have fared worse. And so I think as we think about strategies to help entrepreneurs generally, vulnerable entrepreneurs in particular, who we have to help as a way out of poverty and criminality, then I think that we must address the underlying structural problems of inequity and the negative sociocultural norms that exist in our society that perpetuate some of these problems. And, you know, problems like the epidemic crime problem that we have. Our young men are being killed, and they are doing a lot of the killing. This is unacceptable. They're missing from schools. We're seeing the miseducation, undereducation of our kids, especially our boys. And we're seeing these very high levels of violence against women and girls. And we see the cultural biases against the LGBT community continuing. All of these kinds of gendered lens to look at the problem have structural underlying challenges that we have to address. And so in conclusion, I want to say that the gendered perspectives matter, and these perspectives matter because men, women, boys, girls, gender diverse people all experience COVID differently. And while COVID has negatively impacted most businesses, the most vulnerable businesses have fared the worst. And I hope that some of the data I shared provided some evidence to that, especially those businesses who are plagued with the pre-existing problems of criminality and education. And so the data that I shared provided some evidence of this differential and significant gender impacts. Now, it's important that while organizations like the Lascaux Chin Foundation and other private NGOs, foundations, other initiatives are taking place and are absolutely necessary, and I also want to say, shout out to the diaspora that's doing phenomenal work during this period. It's important that other structural changes be addressed. You know, when this thing started, I remember writing one of my first articles and I said, you know, don't simply reopen the economy, restructure it. And it's a way of saying it's not enough to just go back to where we are. And a lot of people say we're gonna, you know, do this better. But what does that really mean? It means we have to get into the weeds and tackle some of these underlying issues and use some gendered lens in trying to fix the education system. And the kinds of interventions like what we're doing and others are doing with respect to training and so on, again, we have to do it in a way that addresses the real problems, underlying problems that have persisted for decades. And so I suggest that we need these systemic changes, and these changes must address the underlying gender inequality and the inappropriate and sometimes very weak institutions that currently exist and are unable to tackle these problems. I want to end on a hopeful note because a lot of this may sound really depressing, but I really believe Jamaicans can fix it. All of us. If we work together, if we collaborate, we can fix it. This is not something that we can't come over. In fact, I've shown that some of the most vulnerable entrepreneurs are able to wheel and come again, build back their business, restart, and they're out there thriving and surviving. As a nation, we can do it. We have to work together, work better together, tackle these historical problems that we've not been able to address. And I think that if we do it with the kinds of resolve and with the resilience that I know is typical of Jamaicans, we'll be able to get out of this COVID better and stronger. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Professor Hamilton, sometimes we say, you're brave to say all of that. And sometimes we wonder who is listening. And sometimes we wonder why when we speak the truth, why when we give an adequate report, then it requires bravery to have done that. But you see that last point you made about how we just want to go back before we consider the structures that we are going back to? You see those provoking points you raised about the issues we have to address since the time we start to crawl, in how we are educated and socialized, and how we understand our place in this space and time. those are critical things to deal with, and those are critical questions to ask. And it leads us to say, anybody listen? Anybody listen? So on behalf of the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts, on behalf of the SAM department in particular, and the Dean of SAM, Dr. Keena Sr., whose project this is in this Founders Week and this 45th anniversary celebration, I want to thank you for allowing many of us to see that we're not alone, that hand pan hand make hand clap, and I am certainly looking forward to tomorrow morning when we sit down at 11 o'clock and have coffee and examine some of these issues, because we could take one of them for one coffee morning. So we will see what comes up tomorrow, and we encourage all of you to come back and join us. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thank you.